I'm going to start my speech by outlining what punishment would look like under our side of the house and then chat about three things. Firstly, why incentives are unlikely to work. Secondly, what our mechanism is going to create more sustainable structural change. And then finally, some weighing about why our policy is likely to be more long-term. Into what punishment would look like. Firstly, I think that on the counterfactual, we would have seen things like internal probes to get rid of management within the NFL. But secondly, we would also support things like getting lawsuits of unfair hiring practices coming either from players themselves via things like class action lawsuits or external legal action. That being said, our case is not going to be contingent on necessarily getting rid of management. We're also going to just prove that management will change in positive ways as well. Getting into the first claim about why incentives and hiring practices are unlikely to work. The first thing to say here is that it's unlikely that there's ever going to be massive changes implemented by the NFL to competitive fairness of the sport. This is because competitive fairness tends to be valued incredibly highly by the league insofar as sport is perceived as being a meritocracy. So therefore, the kind of draft advantage that you're going to get is probably something that is going to be quite minor to avoid the league getting massive kinds of backlash for just ruining like the nature of football. The second thing to say is that there are just a myriad of factors that impact the competitive success of the team, even if you get minor advantages to the point where this is unlikely to be a tipping point, right? So just contingent on like the level of training facilities that you have. It's contingent on the pre-existing level of coaching that you have. This is particularly true for the best team in the league, so like aren't even super reliant on draft picks, where they already have players that are most important to them, and therefore the marginal returns of getting a small draft advantage is basically going to be non-existent, especially given the fact that draft picks tend to be very risky anyways, because you're often taking on a gamble on like a young college athlete that is unlikely to have a guaranteed payout. The final thing to say here is that if you are racist, which is the reason that coaches of color are not being hired because they're clearly just as competent, it's unlikely this is just going to solve your racism, right? You're still going to think that white players are best for the competitive success of the team because you're white, therefore they are smarter, therefore they're better coaches. But those just tend to be massive networks of corruption in terms of the kind of coaches that are actually hired, right? So like you happen to know the white coach, you are bros with them. There's often underground economic deals that would lead you to hire that person in the first place. And given that managers are often more invested in like hiring their bros, they often have other economic connections with who they're friends with, rather than the actual like competitive success of the team necessarily, it's more likely that you're just going to default to those other metrics. What I want to weigh here is that even if you don't buy anything I just said and they get coaches under their side of a house because these incentives work, why is that still harmful? Two things here. The first thing to say is that to bypass a lot of these incentives, you could just hire black coaches to like lower level positions like field coaches rather than making them head coach where they could actually implement positive kinds of change, but just to like get the positive incentives. But secondly, more importantly, any coaches under their side of a house that are hired through this mechanism are going to be massively tokenized. This is because everyone's only going to think the black coach came to the team because you had this positive kind of incentive, right? You're hiring the black coach because you want to get the draft pick. This is harmful for two reasons. The first reason is that it is just very bad for like the long-term coaching prospects of these individuals because you associate the fact that they are being hired with the notion of they are a diversity pick to help the competitive success of the team. That's going to make other teams less likely to want to affiliate with that coach in the long term, meaning that the long-term success of these coaches where they can implement long-term industry-wide change, which is often where they get more social capital within the NFL in the future, is going to be squandered. But secondly, in terms of just like these people being an icon and actually changing internal norms within the NFL, it is a lot more difficult. We don't care about getting black coaches because they choose more black players, right? Like clearly white coaches still care about that, which is why so many of the players are black. But in terms of like actually creating change within the NFL, when moderate people always just perceive these individuals as being a diversity pick, that's something that's going to be a lot more difficult. Secondly, let's not talk about the counterfactual. Why is our mechanism likely to be substantially more effective? The first thing that I want to do here is characterize current racial sentiments that exist within the NFL, because we think that there's going to be a high level of sensitivity to management basically doing nothing. Firstly, all the Colin Kaepernick stuff. Secondly, just JC and his player coalition actively pushing for change within the industry. I think that thirdly, like the Washington Redskins changing their name is an example of there's like currently some shifting tides and sentiment within management to the point where change is actually possible. How then are we able to create positive change under our side of a house? Two different mechanisms here. Firstly, in our best case scenario, we're going to be able to get rid of and yeet management. The first way that this would happen is either through an external lawsuit from a class action, where like even if these people are very rich, you just get like a bunch of people. Another thing that lawsuits could be fairly effective because there's a lot of tangible evidence of these people just being racist. This is because the qualifications of black coaches are entirely equal, and there are also literally interviews in videos of people using the N-word on camera, which is very, very clear evidence of these people being actively racist and actively problematic to the point where either internal probes would generate like tangible kinds of evidence or external probes could be effective. But secondly, we could just generate enough negative PR to like literally get these people to just step down, right? I'm going to talk even more in the next subpoint about why PR is going to be effective, but insofar as you just like scare these people into stepping down, that is something that could happen. So I think it's very intuitive, like getting rid of management is just a good outcome. In terms of number one, this was the racist management. Number two, future management is likely to be more diverse because you get pressure. Like if you're stepping down because of racial backlash, it becomes more pressure to actually hire diverse people. And also you want to make a good first impression as like the initial management who's not going to be racist. Secondly, more important though, even if we do not get rid of management, we're likely to force management, and this is key panel, to make more accountable hiring practices in the future. So there's going to be massive negative PR if the league does absolutely nothing. And I think that in terms of like, especially given all of the racist stuff that is done, and management cares about PR even if they do not step down for a few reasons. The first thing to say is that within the league, there tends to be fairly quick turnover of managers. This is because teams often yeet managers if they like make a mistake, right? So you can often be a good manager for like a year or two, but then you step down. And crucially, after you step down or you get yeeted from a team, you want other teams to actually have a willingness to be able to hire you in the first place. And they're unlikely to do that if you're actively associated with being a racist individual. Secondly, this also increases the likelihood that managers will get fired in the future the next time that they do something racist, right? Because insofar as like maybe the first or second accusation of saying the N-word or of racism is not going to get you fired within the NFL. But if you don't actually change your practice and there are continual allegations, given that most football teams have like a baseline level of semi-liberal following and they don't want massive boycotts of their games from fans, they have an incentive to actually be somewhat receptive in that regard. I think that finally, these are often just public figures who want to go into sports journalism, later in their careers, and therefore they have an incentive not to actually brand themselves as a racist in order to get future career opportunities. So therefore, even if our mechanism is like largely ineffective, we create enough negative PR directed toward these individuals to have them actually hire more Black coaches in the future. Finally, though, let's just weigh how this changes long-term incentive structures, because I think that any policy that ruins the competitive fairness of the NFL is likely to be incredibly short-term based on the mechanism that I gave earlier. There's a high culture that tremendously values competitive fairness within the league and is perceived as being about meritocracy. So I think that after the first draft pick or the second draft pick, there's going to be backlash against the NFL to the point where they no longer need these policies. Under our side of the house, it's more likely to be long-term because you establish internal precedent within the league that these coaches can be fired, that there could be a massive kind of PR harm that's going to be levied against them in the future. Therefore, you cause all management to be concerned in the future for self-interested reasons, meaning that our policies can have more long-term political capital to actually be sustained. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in opening government.
Thank you very much. And now I call on the leader for the opposition.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, solid. So opening government starts with a model that says that the NFL should feasibly sue itself in court, and their case generally is equally logically sound. So I'm going to start with some framing and then go into our constructive arguments, which will broadly clash with OG, so integrated refutation. But firstly, so some framing. We don't need to prove this policy is perfect, but rather that punishments are going to be largely ineffective and that incentives can be approved upon on our side of the house. We're also fine with designing the policy in ways that deal with OG's qualms. So we can incentivize greater incentives for hiring in higher roles and lower roles, whatever. We would also say that private class action lawsuits are not in the scope of this debate. This is about the NFL taking actions as a corporate entity, not like employees of the NFL or rejected employees who can take private action within courts. The NFL suing itself makes absolutely no sense. That's something we can stand for on our side as well. This is about the NFL as an entity taking action. Finally, we care much more about the results for hiring as opposed to things like tokenism, mostly because tokenism is entirely uncomparative, at which point both sides can say that they only hired the minority because of the incentives that either policies create, right? So it's just totally non-comparative. So given that, why do we think punishment of management is going to be comparatively ineffective? Firstly, unequal hiring is, if it is already demonstrable, is already illegal, meaning the NFL is not a unique actor in this regard. And to the extent that they can enact this policy, it's unclear this is comparatively better than private actors, like employees that were not hired, pursuing this as a civil matter within courts. If anything, we would say that it is to some extent mutually exclusive for two reasons. Firstly, on Gov side, the NFL gets the veneer of handling these things internally and can use it as an excuse to point to within legal battles, i.e. we fired these people so the problem is completely solved. And which means that it's much harder for anyone to sue them if they enact this policy poorly. And moreover, we can defend both the positive incentives from the NFL and punishments from the government, which can exist regardless of the NFL's individual actions. Well, government needs to uniquely prove that government is a comparatively much worse actor than the NFL. So secondly, though, why is it that we think that broad-based incentives for fans are going to be better. So fans don't really care about management having their pay cut or being fired. They care about their team winning and doing well, which is often contingent on things like draft picks, since single star players like Tom Brady can elevate teams enormously and mean that they win like Super Bowls every single year, right? Fans are much more likely to put pressure on teams and coaches in the event where conforming to this policy leads to competitive success, as opposed to just like their coaches not being fired, right? One of them is substantially more likely to happen. NFL teams are relatively responsive to fans, since fan support is how they make all of their money. Meaning that when fans have incentives that are aligned with encouraging diversity, diversity is more likely to happen. So we accept that NFL fans are broadly racist. However, we think that the manifestation of this racism is to like protest this policy as a whole on either side of the house. However, on our side, you can still be like, well, this policy is bad, but at least our team should take advantage of it so we could like win the Super Bowl despite this unfairness. And because of the fact that everyone is telling their like putting pressure on their individual team to conform so that they can get competitive success, and teams are substantially more responsive to their own fans, who are the ones that like buy tickets for them, as opposed to the fans of other teams, you get much less solidified backlash against the policy, comparatively speaking, because the people that matter most to individual teams, i.e. their fans, are still telling them to do things that support diversity. So this is also the neck why the policy is very likely to be strong, right? Because the fact that many teams benefit from these policies, even if not all of them do, means that they have large incentives to make sure that the benefits they're able to get from the fact that they're doing this are large. The other thing is just like OG is just flat wrong about meritocracy in the NFL. The NFL already has tons of policies that create inequality within draft picks. Like there's already a draft order that is designed for essentially affirmative action between teams so that the Browns will like suck less, right? Like I don't actually think that this is such a difficult concept for people to work their head around in the first place. So they're likely wrong. However, on the counterfactual, resistance to the policy is like the uniform, and you see it as sort of not harming your team. So there's no sort of downside to you resisting the policy, and you get more uniform backlash. OG admits that public pressure is powerful, meaning the impact of this argument is conceded by government, and we don't even need to prove it, right? But it's also just significant because given that NFL fans are kind of racist, the policy that you enact needs to have some mechanism to prevent the inevitable backlash, which Gov doesn't have. The second thing is that you get substantially more pressure from players on teams. So players also don't care nearly as much about their management getting a bonus compared to say, or like not being fired or whatever, compared to like winning Super Bowls and stuff like that. This is significant because players are extremely valuable to the NFL and the source of their wealth, but also because they have huge platforms that they can use against their team if the teams are taking action that like prevents them from winning Super Bowls, right? Players in many sports have been able to protest successfully in ways that have power, including strikes, protests, or like other such things. And I would say that the alternative is actually worse. You can get active cover-ups, at which point complaining about your manager doing racist hiring can lead to your manager, like, I don't know, punishing you like in some way because you're sort of outing them in a way that could lead to their punishment. Whereas on our side of the house, saying that there's some sort of inequality that can be solved paves the way forward to your team being more successful. So you think on Gov's side, you silence players and prevent that type of protest, whereas on our side, you can encourage tons of players, especially like white and otherwise complicit players, to be vocally in favor of their team enacting this, enacting diversity so they can benefit from this policy. Finally, you get much less resistance from management. So management probably doesn't like the idea of punishment, and while the idea of having like options that to get a competitive edge may actually be quite appealing. So in Gov's world, they fear punishment, and maybe in the best case scenario, they shift towards hiring more diverse people. But more likely, they pressure the NFL to repeal the policy in the first place or make it as toothless as possible so nothing bad ever happens to them. Before I continue, I'll take closing Gov.
On the counterfactual you're supposed to be defending, you do know that the interview policy is you just have to interview a black guy, and the higher draft picks thing has already been scrapped by the NFL.
Wait, what? I mean, I don't give a shit about that. Honestly, like, look, we could probably support, I don't know, if you guys could feel out anything, we just feel out a better policy. I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't even know anything about the NFL. Feasibly, we should debate this from a reasonable perspective that doesn't require being like an NFL nerd, whatever. Anyways, respond to the analysis of the argument. Don't give counter examples. It's not very compelling. Yeah, so resistance from management. So in Gov's world, you fear this policy, you pressure to have it revoked. The counterfactual is, at minimum on our side, even if some coaches are harmed by this policy or some management is harmed by this policy, half of the teams, if it's zero sum, are benefiting, right? Which means their even if you, on their side, you can get universal backlash against this policy because it can only harm management and never help them. Whereas on our side, at least half of the management benefits from the policy insofar as they get better draft picks and stuff like that, which means you get active support for the policy from at least half of the people within the NFL, which is much better than you're ever going to have on their side. Even if the NFL is bad under the status quo, at minimum, it's going to be comparatively worse on government side, which is probably the reason I don't care, right? If it's bad right now, it's going to be even worse on their side. All of the mechanisms that apply to their policy being even more of a dumpster fire if their claim is that the current policy is a dumpster fire. And for that reason, we're incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. Now I call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, just 1 second. It took the NFL, I don't know, 40 odd years to change the name of the Washington Redskins, because they didn't think that that was racist enough to warrant a change. The fans only changed that after a unique point in history where backlash was such that it was required to get more fans from liberal areas. The point here is that racism is inherent to many NFL fans. This is a league that participates itself often in deep South areas. It's like the literal assumption of the NFL is that a lot of them are rednecks. Like this is like literally what the NFL is trying to cater to by its base. That's why they locked Colin Kaepernick out of getting a job in their league. That's why they didn't do anything towards Black Lives Matter in the same way the NBA and other leagues did. We suggest that if fans changing the league is the metric that open opposition wants to win this debate on, they're probably not going to get very far. I'm going to first chat about long-term incentives and change for these leagues. Secondly, I'm going to discuss fans, and then finally, incentives for change on our side. So what were the long-term incentives that Naomi talked about and Jacob declined to engage with? We explained how positive incentives tended to be short-term, whereas our policy tended to be much more long-term. There's a significant meritocratic bias in the NFL. Now, Jacob says, look, well, you know, there are draft picks that are ordered in a certain way because certain teams finish worse and then they get the higher draft pick. This is correct, but the way it's framed for NFL fans is that that helps with meritocracy. It allows more parity in the league, which allows for teams to compete at a much higher level in a much better way. So meritocracy is literally the way that they frame and justify that system of drafting. Whereas on their side of the house, what does their policy look like to the majority of NFL fans from the deep South who don't like Black people in those higher positions, or at least don't like being mandated to have Black people in those higher positions? What it looks like is that draft picks are being ripped away from them. If they say that draft picks matter in order to get the next Tom Brady, then fans are intensely angry about that rather than intensely happy for that. They're likely to be angry with Roger Goodell, someone who has already pissed off many of the fans in the NFL. And I want to point out, he's the commissioner of the NFL only because the majority of ownership supports him, only because the majority of the fans of those owners support them. What that means is that he's likely to be kicked out of power. The next person is likely to be put into power in a way that revokes this policy, as has been done in the past, as Hamza pointed out in a POI, with literally this policy. It's been rolled back massively in recent years. What that meant was that it was likely into the long term that their policy was absolutely ineffectual. Think about our policy, however, where it puts a long-term incentive on the owners. And here are a couple of important nuances to note here. Our policy does not incur the same fan backlash for two reasons. Firstly, because it does not change the metrics of meritocracy on the field. Fans care much more about what happens on the field rather than the black box that is the owner's room. We suggest that that means our policy incurs a lot less backlash. But secondly, and more importantly, it changed the framework for how managers make their decisions. What's more important, getting one draft pick in the 6th round down the bench where Tom Brady is one in literally like 2 million people, or getting your job and getting a future in the NFL where you're likely to be hired again and again by different teams? We'd suggest that a manager in the long term who's caring about their own personal satisfaction is likely to care about that to a much, much greater degree. So it was unlikely that opening opposition's like mitigation worked. So clearly, long term, we are going to get much greater change. Our policy is going to stay in place. But I also want to point out here, this was a regrets debate. So opposition could not just say, guys, this is really incredible. We're going to have this policy that's going to be really unique and we're going to create a new policy, because they can't. We're talking about a policy that has already existed. The way that the NFL has already implemented these interviewing processes was absolutely heinous. We'd suggest in the counterfactual world, at least some degree of independent arbiters would be much better. I will teach CO, just not right now, okay? Okay, then let's chat about tokenization and the alternative world. We claimed that they were likely to be hired in positions that were not incredibly good. And then opposition says, but you know, you can have quotas in other ways. So for example, we can have head coaches. I just want to point out firstly that that is not how historically that this policy was created. So there aren't quotas for head coaches, there are quotas for coaches in general, which means defensive coordinators, offensive coordinators, etc. And so that is what has actually happened. Like teams have genuinely put African Americans into those positions in some cases, but that doesn't work very well because one, they aren't figureheads for that institution anymore. There's no like role model effect or anything like that, but also because there's no comparative because they don't have very much power within those organizations. So they're still called the N-word by the white players within the NFL and their fellow coaches. Hate crimes are still committed against them because they have no institutional power because they are at the behest of both the managers as well as the head coaches that are predominantly white. And so what it seems to me then is that their side supports a world where that tokenization continues to occur, where those internal structures continue to be biased and flawed, and where coaching as a norm never changes, and you can't change those norms into the future. What that meant was that coaching and coaches' positioning got much worse on their side of the house. Before I move on to explain why our mechanism works, I'll take closing opposition.
The motion information provided to us specifies absolutely nothing about the level of coaches that work, and therefore, given that it says 12 out of 32 have not hired one, that implies that 20 out of 32 have, so the policy appears to be succeeding based upon the information we're allowed to work on.
So I want to point out, that doesn't imply head coach, firstly. And secondly, 12 out of 32 or 20 out of 32, whatever the number is, I don't remember, that is still not very good compared to the NFL, which is about 97% Black athletes, right? So it's about the comparative where there are about probably 90% of coaches who are Black, who have the skills in football, who are able to coach, but only 66%, 60% are actually brought into that field. That suggests a massive disparity in the racist hiring practices. So what did those racist hiring practices look like, and why can we call them out with internal probes? They are very, very overt. We aren't talking about closed door behind the back policies. We are talking about literal recordings that the New York Times has exposed of athletes being, or not athletes, of coaches being called the N-word in interviews, of coaches being denied, not because of their skill, but rather because they are Black as coaches. The NFL is not this like really insidious and like low-key racist institution. No, it is a deeply, deeply racist institution with owners literally saying the N-word in broad space. And unlike the NBA where those owners got kicked out, the NFL did absolutely nothing about them. So what this leads us to believe is that on our side of the house, we get at least some sort of marginal change. Where sure, not every management officer is going to change, as opening opposition points out. We're not saying that they're always going to hire these Black coaches. We're just saying that on the margins, they are much more likely to be fearful of their job versus fearful of changing like the small margin for victory of a game, for example, in their position. What that meant was incredibly likely that not only did they just change themselves immediately for fear of the deterrent effect that getting kicked out of your job would acquire, but also because they feared the public backlash that would ensue. The fact that they would never be able to get a job from another team because it would be suicide for that team to hire that person into the future because they just have to be kicked out or fined again and again and again. What that meant was that in the short term, we get massive changes and stop tokenization of NFL coaches. In the long term, we get changes that amount to people being hired and given opportunities that they would not have on the other side. Fairness is important. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Now we call on the deputy leader for the opposition.
Okay, so for POIs, ask them in the chat, and if I don't take you by 5:30, you can ask me out loud. Okay. So I think aside from opening government being entirely uncomparative with the harms that they exist under incentives, they did zero work to respond to what Jacob tells you, which is that punishment mechanisms via things such as like class action or civil lawsuits are a mechanism that can exist on either side. And what OG had to do was prove a unique benefit that the NFL is as an actor in inflicting these punishments, and why we can't on our side have both in positive benefits to incentives, which have worked with hiring like at least 20 some coaches and can be expanded on. And I'm going to talk more in my speech about why I think they're likely to be pre-pressurized to expand more into the long term. But second of all, we also can co-opt some of the benefits of punishment through mechanisms like the court. OG did zero work to prove why it is the case that they get unique benefits from the NFL as an actor. And if anything, I actually don't think they have any mex in their speech as to why the NFL is going to be a good actor in enacting these punishments, and why you're not going to try and put pressure on them to completely repeal the policy as a whole, having effectively no benefit on opening government side of the house. first thing I want to go through is all of the things that OG says in terms of why incentives are bad and why those arguments fall out of the debate. So they tell us that with under incentives, you're going to hire coaches into low-level positions. Panel, this is entirely uncomparative, right? Because if it is true that your incentives are equivalent no matter where you hire, presumably the punishment would be equivalent no matter where you hire to, and so your incentive would be equally on Gov's world to also hire to a lower level position if that is the thing that won't get you punished, right? So like on our side, we have positive reward. On their side, they have negative reward. But like presumably to the point where you care about the reward not being positive or negative, hiring to low levels exists like comparatively the same on both sides. If it is true that it's not comparative, so the level of punishment gets worse, gets worse if you hire to a lower position, but you're like less punished higher up, or like we'd say that like if you're able to get more incentive positive rewards from hiring people into higher up positions, we say it's good. And we'd also secondly say, if anything, because like managers and teams and fans see positive rewards through these incentives, i.e. like your team performs better because you got a higher draft pick. On our side of the house, you have an incentive to push the NFL to offer even more positive rewards to teams that are hiring coaches into higher up positions to change their strategy to like solve the problem that OG points out, right? So your incentive is to try and push the league to start hiring coaches into higher up positions. So we're actually able to have a mechanism through which fans and players themselves are having willingness to push the league to do better. But in Gov's world, you don't have any of that positive reward, so there's no incentive to do that. So A, I've proven to you that this problem exists, is going to exist still in Gov's world, so their argument falls out of the round. But B, I've shown a positive solution for our side, so I've actually entirely flipped the claim. On tokenization, this completely falls out too. Jacob already responded to the fact that like this exists on both sides. If it is true that you see is hiring someone to avoid a punishment just as a positive reward, there's zero win there for opening government. The last thing we would say that like in terms of that, the same material I tell you flips to our side, right? Because you value these players now because they end up giving your team some type of positive reward through things like drafts, right? So if it's true that these incentives make your team perform better, fans now see these coaches as doing something good for their team on net. So the extent to which you value tokenization as something that's harmful is probably comparatively less on our side because you still see them as the coaches as doing a net positive, as opposed to in Gov's world, you just see them as avoiding a punishment. You don't see the positive reward that your team's able to get. So I'd say the harm that exists through that is still worse. So I've again flipped that claim. The third thing that they tell you is on long-term benefits that you get. So panel, like, look, this is absolutely ridiculous, right? Because if it is true that you get positive rewards through hiring these coaches, I'd also tell you that first of all, this was predicated on their first mechanism, which was hiring coaches into low-level positions and not being able to get change into the long term, right? So I've already proven to you why we're more likely to get it, but why we're more likely to get long-term change on our side. But the second thing I'd say is if it is true that you get positive rewards, your incentive is to keep these coaches within their positions. Your incentive is not to like fire them because usually there are like startup costs to hiring coaches. Teams get to know the coach and work with them. You don't want to have like a lot of turnover with who your coach is as they get to know your players because that tends to be worse for your team. So you're likely to maintain these coaches into the future, but also you want to keep hiring them because you see the positive rewards that your team is able to get. So we say on that is something that is good. The last thing I want to add first, okay, short and long term. If anything, I want to prove to you why it is the case that in Gov's world, it is likely that
I can't hear. Yeah, it froze.
Their internet cut out around yesterday. They did manage to reconnect after a few minutes with their phone. So,
Sure, yeah.
Naomi, do you want to maybe drop them a message? You probably have them right on Facebook.
Yeah, I'll message them in a minute.
All right.
Okay, so I'm talking to Ruth right now, and she's trying to rejoin from a phone, so hopefully be a couple minutes.
Sure.
Okay, I'm here. Can you
Yep.
hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wait, I'm back on my computer too. Great. Okay. Internet struggles. Okay, I think. Wait, I'm hearing echo. Can you?
Yeah. What? It's in my headphones.
I think I was at like 4:30. Is that correct? I tried to pause myself.
Should be fine, probably. Yeah. That was
Yeah?
not taking.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, I'm gonna continue.
Yeah, it was 4:30. Good. Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, great. Cool. Sorry, getting where I was. I believe I was talking about positive and negatives. Okay, cool. Okay, so in Gov's world, they're able to fiat that they're able to like get this policy of punishments, but they can't fiat that exists in the long term. So if closing government wants to come up here and argue that incentives don't work perfectly right now, we'd say on their side, it would only be that much worse, right? That is to say that managers have an incentive to continuously backroll the policy to the point where they have nothing. On our side, at a minimum, there have been teams that benefit from the existence of this policy. And so your incentive is not just to keep the rewards that you have, but your incentive is to push for it further into the future because you're able to keep getting more benefits as this policy continues to exist and continues to get better, right? So you want to push for like more positive incentives if you hire coaches for longer periods of time or if you put them into higher up positions because you see a return on your investment from it. So we get to prove on OO that we're able to not just keep the policy, but continuously push for long-term changes and better policy into the future. I don't think OG did anything to talk about why they get their policy staying in the long term. Closing government is going to have to to deal with this and not just deal with the worst case scenario of incentives because they have to deal with the worst case scenario on their side. Okay. The last thing I would just flag here, in terms of okay. The last thing I want to talk about now is external accountability metrics and why we think that like the idea of like PR, fans and players falls to our side. So in terms of fans, opening government says fans are racist. Look, no, teams care most about their individual fans, and conversely, fans have much more power over their team than they do the NFL as a whole. Meaning, if they apply bad pressure on the NFL and good pressure on their team, the result is net positive. So even if they try super hard to oust the NFL leadership, because they hate our policy, this is the pressure that they will diffusely put on the NFL as a whole, while their concentrated message toward their team is to do whatever they can to win, including hiring diversity picks if it means not having like draft picks stolen from them, right? So we get to win the benefit of fans on our side, whereas they're unable to win that on theirs. In terms of PR incentives, look, social media exists on both sides. You can use media to try and pressure your team to avoid a punishment or pressure your team to get positive rewards. What is the question in this debate then is what is going to spark you to use the media in the first place? We would posit that in Gov's world, as Jacob already said and went unresponded to, you're not incentivized to do this because you worry either that there will be like you'll face fear from your management and other higher ups because there will be a punishment to them. But on our side, you see the benefits to using PR incentives because it only works to help your team, right? You want to use the media to be like, our team can be better. We get a higher draft pick if you do this. So players and fans want to use that social media, and they will actually be sparked to use this. On OO, we prove like efficacy and long-term sustainability. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. Now I call on the member for government.
Just to check, am I audible?
Yes.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. When the Rooney Rule was instituted, we couldn't have ever imagined that the head of the NFL would come up on stage and say Black Lives Matter. We couldn't have imagined that the Redskins, for instance, would have changed their name. We had a unique moment in history after the BLM protests happened in 2020 and even earlier on, where there was capital within the NFL to push for all-encompassing change and the boldest possible policy, but the NFL went for the low-hanging fruit and ended up doing jack shit. By the way, what was the Rooney Rule and what was this low-hanging fruit? Because that's something that no team wants to discuss, perhaps because sports motions aren't very popular to research. Let's look at the first thing in terms of hiring practices. There is actually no rule which mandates that you must hire a Black coach. The rule is that you must interview at least 2 Black people for coaching positions. And additionally, you must interview at least 1 Black person for management positions such as team president, HR, etc. there is no mandation within these rules to actually hire these people. Why is this crucial? Because whatever the fuck O was talking about is contingent on you actually hiring these people. Insofar as these organizations are as racist as everybody in this house has already accepted, I don't know why they're going to hire black coaches, which is why those hiring practices haven't increased. But I'm also going to take them and on their best case scenario that hiring is happening. Why are we still much better off in our world? But before that, only one simple observation. I think O is correct to point out that OG does not talk about why the NFL pursuing this is a good thing. I would note that class action lawsuits and lawsuits in general cost a lot of money. And notice, people without jobs, i.e. black coaches, don't have the money to pursue these cases in court. The second thing I want to note is it takes a lot of time to pursue these sorts of decisions. On the comparative, organizations like the NFL are similar to organizations like FIFA, where there is no cost to these individual coaches to pursue these cases. The organization does it themselves. Secondly, I would note that they take less time because they have considerations such as the season. There are also different standards of evidence. Therefore, the NFL pursuing this is different to actual court cases. What is the first claim I'm going to make about this debate? I would note that everybody's missed justice as an argument in this debate. Like, notice, people in the past, say older black coaches who have now retired, there's no possibility of them getting back into the game, they were discriminated against. They did not get the jobs that they deserved. They did not get jobs based on meritocracy. What were they stripped of because of this? One, they were stripped of recognition that they matter, that they are as good as their white counterparts, perhaps even better, but also recognition of the fact that they were discriminated against. Under our side of the house, when you're pursuing punitive action, you are literally giving them back what they were stripped of. That is a recognition of an injustice and retribution for the harm that you caused these people. Why is this then a good thing? Because notice, discrimination happened against these people. There was a violation of their rights. In their policy, all they're focusing on is future hiring practices. They are doing nothing to redress the harm that was caused to these people. That's the first instance in which we take these actors. And notice, these actors are much more vulnerable than NFL coaches right now, because even if black coaches face discrimination right now, the BLM is there. You have some political capital to push for change. These people had no protections back then and are also financially much less well off than the people in the status quo. But secondly, I would notice within considerations of justice, we're not only helping people in the past, but we're also helping people in the future pursue justice. So in terms of the numerics of this, we are getting much more people on board under our side of the house. The second thing then on change, which has been discussed by opening benches as well, I would note that OG has talked about organizations being racist inherently, but what they have not focused on is the structural problem of why we don't have enough black coaches to begin with. We have lots of black players, by the way, but we have structural problems which are obviously related to racism in a simple sense, but not organizational racism. That is, for instance, you need financial capital to pursue university educations in sports sciences to get your coaching badges that black people do not have access to. You need experience within the high school and university circuits, where if you get state championships, for instance, that's the only way you get to become quarterback coach of NFL teams. And because these circuits are also racist, you don't get access to all of these decisions. There are lots of structural problems outside the ambit of just NFL organizations themselves that you need to solve to get more black people at the very least into coaching. OG is only talking about this pool of coaches that you have right now being affected. Why then do we change not only the organizations themselves, but broadly the other structures which prevent black people from getting into coaching and becoming coaches in the first place? The first thing I want to note here is that the biases are unitary. The biases against coaches and players are very similar. That is based on obviously color, so on and so forth. This is something that OG has talked about. But how do we change these kinds of biases and go towards structural change? Now, OG tells you, well, we get rid of lots of people, and the people that we are going to replace them with are obviously going to be liberals because PR. I'm going to give you a lot more reasons for why the people that come up in the future are better. Because notice, one, our argument is not contingent only on them replacing these people. It is contingent on the fear of a lawsuit itself. That is, the deterrence effect of knowing that you might be fired in the future means that organizations are, one, obviously likely to hire better people in the future to replace these people. But secondly, even when you're not replacing racists, future people who enter your organization, you're likely to say, oh, are they likely to be racist in the future? Let's do a background check of their Twitter accounts and see if they've used the N-word. The third thing I want to note is these people also moderate themselves. So for instance, if you're a management employee within the NFL team, you're likely to not pursue your racist tendencies and inhibitions, quite specifically because of the fact that you know yourself that you will be fired. So practices within these organizations change themselves. The second thing I want to note is there's immense political attention on these organizations as well. Not just the NFL, it is Bernie Sanders, AOC, etc., taking up this issue. The third thing I want to note is media attention on these organizations as well. And this goes beyond OG saying negative PR, because notice, when media does deep insights into racism within the NFL, they're not only talking about the Rooney Rule, they're going to be looking at structures which go beyond the Rooney Rule. They're going to be looking at, okay, why do we only have a pool of 100 black coaches? Why are they not 1,000, and so on and so forth? And this all translates into one last thing, which is a virtuous race to the top. That is, NFL organizations are obviously going to compete to seem to be the most woke organizations and so on and so forth, and hire the best possible people. What are the impacts of this policy? Why do we take it over OG then? One, I think we hire better coaches as well, because notice, O has been talking about tokenistic appointments. OG has also been talking about tokenistic appointments. But notice, at the point at which you are increasing access to coaching facilities, giving them more scholarships, etc., because you think a lawsuit might happen or the fear of a lawsuit is something that's important, you give access to more of these coaches, you increase the chances of their success in the long run, which also battles the negative stereotypes of fans that these guys are talking about. Because if black coaches start winning games and winning championships, you battle these kinds of stereotypes within your organizations. Lastly, your PR departments, etc., other areas of hiring, when you hire people who are not bad or also black, the messaging changes, right? The way you deal with things like players protesting or calling paper taking the knee essentially changes. So your support for players, etc., your messaging changes, and your negative perception and stereotypes also change. For all these reasons, very proud to propose.
Right. Thank you very much. I call on the member for the opposition.
was a treatise on debate strategy. Point number one from closing opposition, they do this interesting thing where they say everything that is in the info slide is certain, and that's the policy they're defending. But what we're doing is not in the info slide and it hasn't been done before, it's uncertain, hence their policy is more favorable. If I was a world schools coach, and I know you are, I would really suggest not advocating for that sort of strategy. Two reasons. This means you can never debate an IR motion anymore, because anything that's in the info slide is the only thing you can debate on. Fuck the developing world. But then secondly, we are given structural reasons which were completely ignored by member of opposition for why our policy is more likely. What were the reasons? There was unique political capital over the last 2 years that we wasted. Washington Redskins had their names changed in the last 2 years. Black Lives Matter protests erupted in the last 2 years. Roger Goodall, one of the most racist people known to mankind, commissioner of the NFL, said Black Lives Matter. Woody Johnson, not just the chairman of the Jets, but the literal British ambassador to the United States ambassador to Great Britain, was reprimanded, one of the most powerful people in America, for his racist attitudes within the team. These things happen, and we squandered our political capital towards taking bolder structural change. That's the framing that came from closing government that they missed in this glib info slide response. Number two, the significance of courtrooms here isn't just the fact that those cases go there, and Taha gave you, by the way, several reasons why, even if this debate is about the NFL prosecuting them, the NFL is still better. But let's assume it's CO now and not OO. The room is still better because depositions happen, court documents come out, witnesses respond, a litany of racist things that these people are doing under the cover now come out explicitly, the point of which they're in the public spotlight of the courtroom. The third thing that they said, again, from a strategic perspective, was really strange. The first premise was you'll only get money out of them. The second premise was getting money is bad because the punishment for rape should not be money. This fucked with me for a couple of reasons. Number one, if the punishment is low, we increase the punishment. That's why we're going for firing these people, systematic and structural change. But number two, this analogy is weird in the sense that we've consistently advocated for reform, which is also a displacement reform. So let me put it this way. Let's just say worst case, they don't fire a single person. This is exactly what Taha says, right? Because if they don't fire a single person and they don't want negative PR, they start funding scholarships for coaches to get badges in universities. They start making sure that the NCAA, from which the NFL coaches come up the stream, starts getting more representation from African Americans. Basically, if they want to save their own people, they will do anything possible to prevent an investigation. We think that's fucking great. Coincidentally, this is exactly what the NFL did in June, the point at which it tried to divert attention by funding $250 million into what it broadly calls pro-Black Lives Matter activities. This is exactly what we want. We win in either case. The final thing that they said was that now there's going to be a search for justification problem, which is like, it's going to be hard to justify not hiring Black coaches. I say, no. Have you ever seen hiring practices ever? He wasn't good enough. Not enough experience. We don't have enough money. Like, I can name 3 reasons, and I'm not even a fucking NFL manager for why you wouldn't hire this person, irrespective of whether they get to the interview stage. You are still defending a very diluted policy. But the fifth thing that they said was amazing. This is out of like some Black queer feminist class that you take in a liberal arts college. The essentialization of a Black body is a huge problem. You know, when players are physically fit and they like move around, that's a problem. And when you have a Black guy in a suit, that's fucking amazing. 2 problems with that. One, if that's true, people will realize that you're tokenizing said Black guys, so that just flips all of your harms. But number 2, we don't particularly care as long as we're getting structural change. Again, read Taha's extension that was completely ignored. Before I discuss opening opposition, I will take their engagement. Point of information. Go ahead.
Okay, please be remotely comparative. If you dislike the current policy and think it's toothless because it's interviewing instead of hiring, that's not comparative. You never prove why your policy would be any more progressive in how it's enacted. And also, lawyers on our side can still take on high-profile lawsuits on commission, so we can get equivalent court justice.
I know I'm ESL, but I literally did just now. Like, I spent 2 minutes on political capital, how we had a fuck ton of political capital for the events of the last 2 years, could have achieved bolder reform. And then I did an even if thing just to make sure that we win, that even if we don't get a single person fired, we still have incentives to displace this. That doesn't help at all. We still have incentives to displace these things by being like, okay, we can't fire our best friend Brad. Let's put in $250 million to funding scholarships for African American coaches. Like, either way we win. I don't know what else to do physically as a debater. Opening opposition, 4 problems. The first problem with their argument again is that they miss what model they're defending, right? Because the model they're realistically defending is not the model which is in the info slide, which is to do with interview quota. Secondly, and much more substantively, they miss the political and media capital argument. The argument here being very simply that media scrutiny is significantly higher on our side, as Taha identifies to you, because the spicier story will always be NFL team under investigation over this fluff story. NFL hires one more black coach, right? Realistically, the thing that the media agencies will pounce on is, the spicy investigation happening in the NFL. That's when you get the in-depth, long-depth articles from the and New York Times. That's when you get the investigative pieces which expose their systematic racism. The third problem with them, again, is that they miss the idea of a future past distinction, which is the same inherent weakness in opening government as well. That we showed you this debate isn't about injustices that will happen in the future and preventing them, which is fair enough. You also saw that people have suffered injustices in the past. People like Eric Banyami, the head of the Kansas City State football team, who faced systematic injustices in being hired in 2014. This guy gets fuck all in opening opposition's world because the same managers who are in Kansas City State will continue to play and manage these teams forever. At least in our world, if we topple one manager, this manager has probably caused problems for several black coaches who face systematic injustice. The final problem then with opening opposition, shared with opening government, is the problem with just talking about coaches versus talking about trickle-down change. We uniquely showed to you that even if you replace one manager of one team in the 32-team NFL, this person is inherently likely to also change their other attitudes. So for instance, if they have biases towards African-American coaches, they probably manifest in biases towards coordinators and players and all of that stuff. Those biases also change the point at which this manager is removed. So it's not just change for individual coaches, it's institutional change. Two additional reasons, apart from the reasons I gave for why we beat opening government. The first reason we beat opening government is that we don't just talk about superficial bias. Black guy, can't hire him. We give you structural, racialized reasons for why badging is denied to these coaches, funding is denied to these coaches, and how we resolve those problems. Secondly, the past-future distinction that I've shown you. Thirdly, the difference between individuals versus trickle-down change. And then finally, we showed to you that the unique context in which this debate is taking place, the reason why I think the CA set the motion in the first place is because there was so much capital to do something bolder than the Rooney Rule. That's what the government case is based on. We showed you that bolder change was a recipe for progress within the NFL. This change was denied for the sake of justice, for the sake of structural change, and for the sake of the context in which we're having this debate. I am so proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Now to close this debate, we call on the opposition whip.
Hi, am I audible? I think you said yes, but you muted yourself.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just confirming with admin that I am happy to be streamed now. And cool, perfect. So points of information you can pop in the chat just with your team code, and I'll go through at a point and I'll fish one out. In a moment, I will count like 10, 9, and then leave some space, and you can sort of discern from that when I'm going to be starting the speech. 10, 9. It's funny that Hamza opens his speech by chatting about debate strategy and then spent 90 seconds of wasted time repeating irrelevant factual assertions. Seems like our strategy worked because none of the important clash in this debate was predicated on those facts. It's particularly rich then when the speech goes on to quote the Infoslide's rebuttal, saying that what we were doing was wrong in that regard. Look, not all racism is generic store-brand racism. It is distinct, and the racism of the NFL has its very own horrifying stench. Let's engage with that rather than generic analysis on affirmative action, which doesn't apply here. 2 points in the whip. The first is, what does this particular brand of racism look like? How does the construction of that change from our policy comparatively? The second is comparative efficacy, going through all the Mexican government line by line. Lots of the rebuttal will be there. So, this narrative is specifically attached to a conception of value of African Americans in NFL football as being valued for their body and for aggression on the field. It's an inherently racist version of value, which is the cause of there being more black players than coaches. It should be intuitive for that reason. The reason we need to get coaches, and what all teams in this debate should be agreeing about, is as follows. It breaks down that racialized connotation because coaching is not just seen as a player exercise, it is seen as a specifically technical exercise, and because it is also one where there is an emotional connection and trust with the players necessary, it is interpreted as being intellectual, as being strategic, and being emotional in nature. And so when we get players into those positions of coaches, we can see that the narrative is slowly challenged and broken down over time. That's why Gov's response was insufficient here about it just being a black man in a suit. Ron gave you a nuanced case about how the narrative exists in the world and how, regardless of hiring, it can be challenged and tackled over time on our side through the process of the media during the interview process, as we can see happening in the real world. There should be a presumption on government, after Ron's detailed analysis of how the change is occurring, to explain why the appearance of success of this policy isn't doing what it appears to be doing. We got no structural reasons why what's happened isn't good progress. Not only does Ron explain why this policy gets more coaches in, he says there's an inherent value to challenging the narrative here from the interview process itself that was never refuted. This also spills out into society. People view Yank footy as a collective endeavour and view society the same way. There's clearly a transfer of those racial narratives out into society, and so we can also claim slightly bigger impacts on altering that over time. Also, that's why many of the Black Lives Matter things have played out from football. So I think that covers a lot of the clarification. I'll take Naomi before I continue.
So this motion is not just about lawsuits. It ignores a major component of our model of internal probes, like the league deciding to fire people or suspensions and warnings, which does create the negative PR that was in OG and not CG.
I'll get to it, Naomi. Don't worry. I'm going to go through all of your mechanisms. I actually think you had 9 of them. I'm going to make sure I address all of them. First mechanism, though, is the lawsuit one we get a lot from CG, that the NFL can step in and get justice by supporting class action lawsuits. On the principle, Ron responds here, I think, pretty well on why these are so damaging to the cause. Implicit within that is a moral comparative. If pursuing justice for past wrongs leads to future wrongs, we shouldn't do it. To the extent that injustice is equal in that way, but harm is not, and to the extent we can protect people from future moral harm, but not from past moral harm, we should prioritize that. So morally, it's contingent on the mechanism success. So what did Ron tell you here? 1, that confidentiality leads to silencing of criticism and allows racists to hide. And so government whip's response here was insufficient because it asserts that these massively powerful organizations lack capacity to silence these discussions and keep courts closed. Secondly, super injunctions exist and are used frequently in these cases. Thirdly, generally their characterization of lawsuits is in tension with opening government's characterization of what the policies in this debate look like, that there is an active fear by the NFL to attack teams too heavily because it may jeopardize the legitimacy of the league. But quite simply, if their impact was, we might get to hear more evidence of racism. There's no delta here because we already know at this point that there is lots of racism. It doesn't create change to know about it, but also libel and slander and hate speech is also illegal. And so we can pursue traditional mechanisms for outing racism, even if it's just investigative journalism. Good lawyers can do that. It doesn't need to be the NFL specifically. It just needs to be people with money. Lawsuits, we also say, aren't seen as just, and they don't weigh into the ability to change public sentiments. We say justice isn't actually served in many cases. It's just cash, which allows people to buy their way out of injustice. No response to that principle from CG. There's also a perverse incentive here not to look at structural change, because now they weigh the costs, and if they think it's cheaper to stay racist and do nothing, if getting sued is the only cost, then they never change. So CG's mechanism, out. Let's deal with OGs. Incentives don't work, they say, because the NFL won't implement big changes. They highly value competitive fairness, so it would only be a minor draft advantage. Note at the top, this is contradicted by a later claim in the PM on policy reversal, which I'll flag up later, but also I think the extent of willingness needs to be equal in the debate, because fines or managerial restrictions equally affect the competitiveness of a team and equally appear that way. Probably it's about the inherent efficacy of each side, with equal willingness and capital put behind the policies. Next, they say that this does not solve racism, because still they still think white players are better, and this is caused by corruption where coaches hire their friends. Note there's a massive concession within this analysis on people hiring others like themselves. Therefore, if we do get more African-American coaches, it's likely to trickle across to more hiring processes, more African-American coaches, snowballing into the industry over time. See Ron's analysis here. Note, that also works for lower level coaches because we increase the critical mass, even if that comes from the coach level, not the head coach level. Read that in the context of the concession in the DPM in response to Ron's POI, that there has already been a lot of change. We're moving rapidly to a tipping point on our side, which resolves this issue in the long term. You'll notice that's all the logical links in conceded analysis and truths within opening government. So I think structurally, they've locked themselves out of the debate on that alone. But we also don't think that that's the primary reason for racial exclusion of African-American coaches. As I say, it's not about whether or not you're someone's mate, because you already are people's mates, because you've presumably been on a team with them and have some level of comradeship. It's about the difference in how they are valued. It's about whether or not they're seen as valuable for emotional thinking. Next, they say that they'll just hire low-level coaches instead. I've already dealt with this. It's not about whether or not you're a figurehead or a role model or, as CG put it, a black guy in a suit. It's about the deconstruction of the racist narrative of that person's value of to their team and everything. And that comes from the interview process, not the role they play afterwards. It comes from sports journalists reporting that they are in consideration and speculating on that hiring decision, which involves discussion of the criteria which might be used and how well candidates meet that criteria. That's a necessary means by which individual specific African Americans are shown to have the values which are useful as coaches. And indeed, as CG concede, you need to interview 2. So that necessitates some comparison between them, which comes with it the conceit that there is a spectrum of skill which they can fall on, and it inherently challenges the idea that all African American candidates carry the same skill sets and are interchangeable or tokenistic in this regard. It undermines all of the tokenism stuff they claim because it necessitates that comparison. And unless closing government think that these coaches actually are inferior, once teams see that skill set, they'll hire them because they like better coaches, because it means they win more and get more money. Yes, it's not incredibly fast, but it creates change to how that narrative sits in people's minds over time. It's an invasive narrative which changes the discussion over time. And that should be much more compelling than the version of with the argument OO gave you about nebulous forms of pressure. It also undercuts GovWhip's 3 weak reasons coaches might use to reject applications, because media will have already discussed the assets, and so it's hard to make the sell on that because you've already had the counter argument to, oh, this person will cost a lot of money for us, so we shouldn't do it, which was a pretty weak and symmetrical reason, to be honest, and so probably not very persuasive anyway. But also, there's the tokenism argument. I think if there are many factors leading to success in the league, it stands to reason that some of these black coaches will succeed and will see success, and they won't be viewed as purely tokenistic. You also get player testimonials which speak to the ways coaches help them, and that is seen as tokenistic on their side, but not on ours, because it's primed by the same narrative of usefulness of the coaches that comes out during the interview stage. There's also a concession in this point that there will be more coaches, so CG is intention when they apply that none will be hired. Very simply, we told you we do get more coaches in, and it solves the structural problems over time in the league, but we also change the narrative and tackle it on the way that it fits into people's heads, and that is specific to the motion and specific to the problem we're dealing with here, so we win.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for that debate.
Thanks, everyone.